Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from The Gentle Storm, titled The Diary. I've been looking forward to this project since the very beginning of this year. Now, longtime followers of my reviews probably aren't all that surprised by this, but everybody else is probably perplexed by where this album came from, who this duo is, and why anybody else should care. Now, for those of you who don't know, The Gentle Storm is a project under the direction of Arjen Lucassen, singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and creator of the Ayreon project, an ongoing progressive metal act that pulls in vocalists from dozens of the most critically acclaimed acts in symphonic, progressive, folk, and even extreme metal. Now, one of his longtime collaborators is Anneke Van Giersbergen, frontwoman of The Gathering, and who's worked with acts as varied as Devin Townsend, Within Temptation, and even Napalm Death. Now, together, the duo decided in 2014 to collaborate on a new project, a double album under the name The Gentle Storm. Both discs would contain the very same compositions, but one would be played entirely with folk and acoustic instrumentation, and the other was all out symphonic and progressive metal. And both discs would tell the exact same story, an epic historical romance, one of the few times that Arjen Lucassen has ventured away from the sci-fi epics that have typically been his purview. Now, on some level, I was a little bit skeptical of this. With the exception of Guilt Machine, I've had mixed results with Arjen's side projects and solo albums, having never really been a huge fan of Ayreon, and Star One rarely hitting me as hardly as I've hoped it would. Plus, that double disc format struck me as the duo really hedging their bets. I mean, were the compositions really so strong that they'd be able to be transferred to entirely different instrumentation and maintain their impact and tone? Now, granted, this isn't the first time that Arjen has done this. The first Ayreon release, The Final Experiment, it had an acoustic version as well that's actually pretty good. But I couldn't help but feel that the record might just be a little bit better if they just selected the more poignant version of each track on the album and just interweave metal and acoustic together on one disc. I mean, they've done it before, it's worked out well. But you know what, this is the format that they chose, and I knew that Arjen Lucassen was a songwriter who has never made an outright bad album. This was a team of absolute veterans in writing and instrumentation. It certainly wasn't shying away from being a really ambitious project either. So I made sure to give this double album my full attention. Was it worth it? Well, if I'm being honest, I'm a little bit underwhelmed by this. But the question becomes whether or not my feelings are rooted in genuine issues with the album or just expectations that I had that certain elements could have been handled a little bit better. Because let me stress this, The Diary by The Gentle Storm, it's a damn good double album that you should all go out and get. But you know what, the more times that I've gone through it, I've been just left wondering if it could have landed a little bit more emotional impact, at least for me. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, if you're looking for more impact, there's a whole Storm disc that delivers the progressive and the symphonic metal that you're looking for. You just ignore the gentle disc entirely. Well, here's the odd thing. They didn't just opt for conventional acoustic folk rock on that disc, they instead went for a much more eclectic instrumental palette with more strings, woodwinds, and overall more distinctly textured and unique sound. The Storm disc has some of that, but incorporates a heavier backing, male chorus, horns, and more multi-tracking for Anneke to balance against the rougher guitars and the much heavier grooves. And of course, the production is absolutely top of the line. This is Arjen we're talking about here. I come to expect that. But again, I'm left wondering why more of the eclectic instrumentation couldn't have been brought in to augment the Storm disc to create a more colorful and unique metal sound. You wouldn't have to lose the guitar solos to do that. It'd make the tracks a little bit longer, sure, but come on, this is progressive metal. We're used to that already. And as it is, it leads to a bit of an odd setup where tracks like Heart of Amsterdam that blends folk with an almost smooth jazz feel, or Shores of India with its distinctive Indian instrumentation, they're trying to set up unfamiliar vistas, set up those exotic locales where the gentle version just feels more appropriate, simply because the instrumentation matches the period and the setting that much better. And you know what? It's kind of funny, because in the majority of these cases, the melodies and compositions are indeed strong enough to stand up as both acoustic and metal tracks. Arjen's always had a knack for writing strong and memorable melodies that'll stick regardless of instrumentation, and he's no slouch here. But there are places where the overall tone of the song from the lyrics might fit better as either acoustic or electric. Now, thankfully, we do get both, and I reckon everybody will eventually come up with their preferred version of every single song for unique sequencing if they want to blend it down to a single disc. But for me, the gentle tracks were pretty easy choices in the lighter and more adventurous cuts, while the Storm tracks are best suited for the heavy grooves and the darkness that came from real peril and darkness on this album. Now, prime examples of some of that tonal mishmash come on songs like The Greatest Love, a song that's written in exaltation that a child is on the way, or The Child's Birth and Eyes of Michiel. Tonally, it just feels a little bit weird paired with heavier guitars, horns, and a melody that already plays in a lot of minor chords. It works a little bit better better with a more stripped back arrangement on the gentle disc. Now that being said, there is definitely major standouts with each of the double albums. Heart of Amsterdam, Shores of India, Eyes of Michiel, and the gentle disc, all of them are great songs, and basically any song that has the word storm in its title on the storm disc, where the darker grooves actually really play to the advantage, and they actually can bring in more of that ghostly, stormy texture. Actually, the Storm and New Horizons, generally awesome songs on both discs. Probably the album stands out in terms of composition, being able to balance very different executions, both in metal and acoustic. Interestingly, the choice to downplay the instrumentation on both versions of the moment gives them very similar tracks on both albums, with the Storm version taking just more of a gothic approach, and just adding a little bit more electric guitar in the outro, which actually reminded me a little bit of Guilt Machine, which was a good thing, because it works pretty well given the subject matter. I like the song. So okay, let's talk about some of that subject matter, shall we? Now, in a change of pace from most of Arjen's projects, the concept is actually pretty simple in terms of plot. It's a romance set in the golden era of Dutch seafaring in the 1600s between a married couple, the man Joseph venturing to Batavia in India on a 2.5-year voyage, and his pregnant wife Suzanne left behind, penning the titular diary. The romantic stakes, they aren't driven by interpersonal conflict, but by the realities of time, distance, the dangers of Joseph's travels on the high seas, and Suzanne's failing health. And I gotta admit, there's a certain gut punch in realizing on the final track that Joseph, he's not gonna make it back to Amsterdam on time to tend to his wife before she dies. In our narrator's final entry in that diary, it's sadly prophetic and really kind of sad. In other words, it's a pretty decent tragedy, and the fact that Anneke wrote all of the lyrics does lend them a certain poetic fluidity that can sometimes falter in some of Arjen's songwriting. But it's also here where we run into a couple problems, and some moments of unrealized potential that really did irk me throughout both these albums. Now, you'd think that since Anneke is the only singer on this album, that the narrator would be confined to the woman's perspective, almost reminiscent of The Observer on Steven Wilson's most recent and excellent album, Hand Cannot Erase. Except there are tracks on this record where the perspective abruptly shifts to Joseph's POV. Now, I totally get why. You show snapshots of the storms and the conflicts he faces, and the exotic locales that he sees to him. That's a major part of the conflict and driving the album's momentum. But why not have Suzanne describe these scenes as Joseph writes them in the letters that she reads, then from his direct perspective, thus allowing her to add her context and further points of view, keep things consistent? Or rather, let's simplify this even further. Why didn't Arjen just find a male singer for that male perspective if he didn't want to sing? Or why didn't he sing it himself? He's got a good enough voice. But you know what? That's an artistic choice. If Anneke was handling all the vocals, I can respect that. She's got the pipes to do it. She's that good of a singer. But it ties into an issue in the songwriting, in that outside of certain scenes, the poetry can get awfully vague in sketching a more detailed picture. Now, there are snippets where you get more exposition, but they're confined to the liner notes in the booklet, and they never actually show up as spoken word moments in the music, or anything to articulate the larger framing device of the album itself, which is the discovery of this diary hundreds of years later. Now, granted, when the lyrics are parsed out, the story becomes pretty clear and pretty obvious without needing that extra exposition. But I'm also left with characters that only seem to be defined by their love for each other, without much additional dimension or detail. Because for as much as this album is structured as Suzanne's diary, we get precious few insights into her thoughts and passions beyond her love for her husband, what she does during the day, what she's thinking about, and even less for Joseph himself. He leaves for 2.5 years, and there's nothing that assails either of their faith in each other, no questions, few moments of despair, and this ties into the album's momentum and dramatic arc. When your only real conflicts are driven by the environment and time in a relationship that seems unbreakable and unassailable by anything else, the only real question on this album is whether or not Joseph will make it home in time. And there's nothing that either partner can do to really affect that question. It makes both of them lack an agency and inactive protagonists, because they both have no control how fast that ship will eventually get home, how long that mission will take. And while you could argue that the larger theme of this album is how fragile that connection is when it's tied to a few letters in the face of the larger world around it, and how that love is simply so strong to manage to carry over that, it's hard to build a real emotional investment in either character when we don't actually hear Joseph's reaction upon his wife's death, or meeting his son for his first time. That could be really powerful moments that we just don't see. Or more of Suzanne's innermost thoughts and desires just beyond unrequited love love while he's gone. Seeing more of that scene in Amsterdam, there could have been more just to flesh out her character there. Look, in the end, I feel I'm being awfully hard on a progressive rock project that's honestly nowhere near bad. I argue the choice to split into 2 discs, it was indulgent, but it does let the listener pick out the version that they prefer the most. And the actual compositions themselves are pretty damn excellent. And yeah, sure, part of this is me having high expectations for both performers. But the more I've listened to this double album, the more I just wish it had a more focused edit to really click with me and really have that emotional content to really stick the landing. As it is, it's a well executed, albeit very basically sketched tragedy. Not either artist's best side project, but far from their worst. For me, it's a very solid 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're a fan of acoustic folk, progressive rock, and symphonic metal. But I wouldn't expect something on the level of, say, Ayreon or Guilt Machine. Still, you know what? There's a place for a good, simple love story that's well told. And you know what? It's one of the good ones. So check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.